Most people look at a steak and see red meat. A butcher looks at that same steak and reads the white streaks like a map, because those fine lines of fat threaded through the muscle are the entire difference between a forgettable dinner and a meal you'll talk about for years. And once you understand what you're actually looking at, you'll never choose a steak the same way again. Welcome to the Meatz. Today we're going deep on marbling, what it is, why it matters more than almost any other factor when picking a steak, how the world's top grading systems actually measure it, and the one cut that rewrites everything you think you know about fat. Stay with me to the end, because the final reveal is the kind of thing that changes how you shop, cook, and eat steak forever. Let's start with the basics, because marbling is one of those words people throw around without really knowing what they're describing. Intramuscular fat, that's the clinical name, is fat that forms not around the outside of a muscle, but woven through it. The thin white lines and flecks you see running through a raw steak are pockets of fat sitting inside the muscle fibers themselves. And they don't just look beautiful, they do something extraordinary the moment heat is applied. When a well-marbled steak hits a screaming hot cast iron pan or a blazing grill grate, those fat deposits begin to melt from the inside out. They baste the surrounding muscle fibers as they cook, keeping them moist and tender in a way that no amount of butter basting or marinade can fully replicate. The fat also carries fat-soluble flavor compounds, the rich, beefy, almost buttery notes that make a great steak taste like something on another level. Lean meat just can't compete. It might be tender if it's cooked perfectly, but it will never have that depth of flavor. Now here's something most people don't know, and I want you to hold on to this because we're going to come back to it. Not all marbling is equal. The breed of cattle, what they were fed, and even the specific muscle you're cutting from all affect the quality and distribution of that fat. And the difference between marbling that looks impressive and marbling that actually delivers is something even experienced cooks get wrong. We'll get into exactly how to read it in a minute. First, let's talk about how the industry measures marbling, because this is where grades come from. In the United States, the USDA grades beef on a scale that goes from select at the bottom up to choice in the middle and then prime at the top. Only about 2% of all beef produced in the U.S. earns a prime grade, and marbling is the single biggest factor in that determination. Prime beef has abundant intramuscular fat, choice is moderate, select is minimal. The difference on the plate is not subtle. A USDA Prime ribeye and a USDA Select ribeye from the same animal breed, cooked the same way, are genuinely two different eating experiences.
Japan takes this even further with their beef marbling score, the BMS scale, which runs from 1 all the way up to 12. And at the top of that scale sits Wagyu beef, particularly the A5 grade, which is the highest classification possible. A5 Wagyu, especially from the Kobe or Miyazaki regions, has so much intramuscular fat that the red meat almost becomes the minority. The steak looks more white than red. And cooking it is a completely different game. You don't need oil, you barely need heat, and you certainly don't need to cook it beyond medium rare, because the fat content means it stays luxuriously soft and rich, even at a fairly low internal temperature. Here's the part I promised we'd come back to, the fact that not all marbling delivers equally. Fat quality matters just as much as fat quantity. Grass-fed beef, for example, tends to have lower overall marbling compared to grain-finished beef, but the fat it does have contains higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid, which affect the flavor in a distinctly different way, often described as earthier, grassier, more mineral. Grain-finished beef, particularly corn-finished, develops more marbling and a sweeter, more neutral fat flavor. Neither is objectively better. They're genuinely different flavor profiles, and knowing which one you're buying lets you cook and season accordingly. Now let's talk about cuts, because this is where the practical knowledge lives. Not every muscle in a cow marbles the same way. The muscles that do the least work, the ribeye, the short loin, the strip loin, tend to develop the most intramuscular fat because they don't need to be as lean and fibrous to support movement. That's why a ribeye is almost universally the most marbled steak on the menu. The spinalis dorsi, the cap of the ribeye, sometimes sold separately as ribeye cap, is arguably the most marbled, most flavorful single cut on the entire animal. If you have never cooked a ribeye cap steak, that is your homework after this video. On the other end of the spectrum, something like a flank steak or a skirt steak has almost no intramuscular marbling. The fat sits outside the muscle, and the muscle fibers themselves are long, coarse, and designed for constant movement. That doesn't make them bad, it makes them different. They reward different techniques: fast, high-heat cooking, sliced thin against the grain, and strong marinades or rubs that complement rather than compete with their bold, intense beef flavor.
Here is the butcher secret for today, and this one is genuinely worth writing down. When you're at a butcher counter or a grocery store evaluating marbling on a raw steak, don't just look at how much white fat you can see. Look at how fine and distributed it is. A steak with many thin, spiderweb-like threads of fat running evenly through the entire cross-section will outperform a steak with a few thick, chunky deposits every single time.
Fine marbling melts more evenly and completely during cooking. Chunky fat deposits can remain waxy and render unevenly, leaving pockets that don't contribute the same way. Even distribution equals even flavor. That's what you're hunting for. And now the final piece, the thing I told you would rewrite what you know about fat. The conventional wisdom has always been that more marbling means higher fat content means less healthy. And while that's technically true in terms of calories, the science on saturated fat in beef has gotten considerably more nuanced over the last decade. The stearic acid in beef fat, one of its primary saturated fatty acids, is actually considered neutral in terms of its effect on LDL cholesterol by most current nutritional research. This doesn't mean you should eat a pound of Wagyu every day, but it does mean that the fear of beef fat as a purely negative force in your diet is a much more complicated conversation than the old headlines suggested. The fat in a well-marbled steak isn't just there for flavor, it's a legitimately complex nutritional substance that researchers are still working to fully understand. So the next time you're standing in front of a steak counter, you're not just looking at color and size. You're reading texture, fat distribution, and breed story. You're thinking about whether it's grain-finished or grass-fed, whether the marbling is fine or chunky, whether the cut comes from a hard-working muscle or a lazy one. That's the difference between someone who eats steak and someone who really understands it. If this broke down marbling in a way that actually changes how you think about buying and cooking steak, drop your favorite cut in the comments. I read every single one. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And next time on the Meatz, we're going into the world of dry aging. What actually happens to meat over days and weeks, why it smells the way it does, and the moment it crosses from incredible to inedible. You do not want to miss that one.